I just met LeeAnn Mckenna this evening. And I need to apologize already. We've got her name in our program as Lee. I asked her which she preferred, and she said, well, either one, but my mother called me LeeAnn. So, better go with Mum's definition. I'm going to allow LeeAnn the privilege of telling you more about her story this evening, because that's what UTalks are all about. So, LeeAnn, thank you for being here with us this night.
Did you know that nonviolent resistance is historically twice as effective as violent resistance? The nonviolent resistance is far more likely to issue in democracies that are both peaceful and stable. In their 2011 book called Why Civil Resistance Works, Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan compiled the evidence to prove it. And their data are not only affirming for those of us who have so often seen evidence on the ground to support such a thesis, it's such a welcome antidote to the daily news of terrorism, guerrilla warfare, and insurgency. Because I go to places that are considered hopeless, that is, low economic development and literacy rates, fractionalization along ethnic, linguistic, and religious lines, mountainous terrain, and the presence of ongoing internal wars and simultaneous violent movements, I am particularly interested in two of their findings. One, victories achieved through violence do not usually translate into democracy, and are more likely to lead to a recurrence of civil war within 10 years. And secondly, seemingly hopeless conditions can change with skillful resistance. So I'm going to invite you along on a ride to take you to two places that I myself have been tempted to label as hopeless. South Sudan and Northeast India have recently both signed peace agreements following ethnically driven armed violence. On the 9th of July, 2011, South Sudan was welcomed by the United Nations as its newest member state. The day was bright with parades and music and speeches. And they had erected billboards around their parade grounds celebrating the 2.5 million martyrs who had given their lives so that this day might come. There was a seemingly unquenchable sense of hope. But within days, cattle rustling and ancient animosities resumed with shocking ferocity. Cattle rustling is not new. In fact, it's a common practice of many generations. But in this largely rural country, cows are the common coinage, exchanged for brides, ensuring an expanding family. But cattle rustling's toll has expanded exponentially, driven by decades of civil war between the North and the South, and a growing underclass of young men left out of the bride market, marginalized by an economy dominated by foreigners, and debilitated by 50 years of a mostly non-functioning education system. The two largest tribes in the country, the Nuer and the Dinka, had forged a governing coalition of sufficient length to put in place a new parliament, some legislative frameworks, as well as luxurious gated housing for themselves. But it unraveled by December 2013 into hellish slaughter. To the 2.5 million martyrs and the 4 million displaced and dispersed could now be added 10 to 50,000 dead, and another 2 million forced to flee from their homes. I saw those billboards, and I wanted to ask first myself and then 20 participants in a training there, was it worth it? Was it worth it? Yes. Yes, they wanted to say, yes, it was worth it. Surely it is the only possible answer to that question. Northeast India has also been disrupted by decades of civil war, 600,000 killed, hundreds of thousands displaced. The Washington Post has named it one of the most underreported war zones in 2014. Northeast India, tiny as it is unusual in India. Mostly Christian, mostly tribals, considering themselves Mongolians and therefore ethnically distinct from the largely Caucasian India. The central government, on the departure of the British Raj, reneged on promises of autonomy to the Northeast. And as is so commonly the story, insurgency movements formed. It split and then proliferated, turning weapons on one another and distracting themselves from the real cause of their suffering. The Indian government and its policies of nepotism, neglect, and militarization of the region. Hopeless. It must be hopeless. But maybe not. I'm the founding executive director of an organization called Partera. It's Spanish for midwife. It's not a reference to babies, but rather to the methodology, which is playful, experiential, elicitive, drawing out of people what they already know, and popular, of the people. They are the experts, not me. So imagine this. We're in a circle in a desert compound west of Khartoum. You are pregnant, I say to them, effecting a late-term waddle as I navigate the circle. You are pregnant. I look each one of them in the eye. Maybe some of them, the women are mothers, but most of them are not married. The men, they're beginning to get a little nervous, wondering what they've signed on to. Everything you need to know, your wisdom, your story, everything that you need to know has already been gestating inside of you all your life, since the beginning of time. The DNA of what issues from this piece of work belongs to you, not to me. I often carry with me a carved wooden figure of a woman. She's right here. I call her Mzara. It's a North African name for mother of all life. She's kneeling. She's covering her face with her hands. I imagine that she is both weeping and praying. And she's expecting. This is you. This is you. Giving birth to your future is hard work. It will bring you discomfiture and it will bring you pain, but it will be worth it. In this training, there is nothing that is not up for interrogation. Culture, civics, economics, gender, religion, tribe, and all through the dual lenses of what drives violence. What of these things, this myth-making, what we tell ourselves about ourselves and about others, and what makes for peace? People are come together over seemingly insuperable barriers of race and language, tribe, religion, and story. Stories of violence and vengeance, of oppression, of theft, of atrocity. Sometimes when people first get together, they huddle. with their own, because those stories are so near, so recent, so ongoing, not yet forgot. But whether we are doing economic literacy training, gender, identity, rank and privilege, or we're doing a training in economic or in situational analysis, or third-party nonviolent intervention or direct action, we play. Extended simulation games, role play, street theater, exercises that elicit from participants more than they ever imagined possible. Strength, vulnerability, self-awareness, other awareness, profound questioning of social, cultural, and political norms, position and interest, feelings and needs. They then go out from a week or a month trained as trainers and transformed, and ready to train more trainers who will then go on to train more trainers, thousands upon thousands. Participants are led through experiences, often laughter-inducing, sometimes trauma-triggering, often discomforting. And we ask them to then unpack the experience, to learn from the experience, and we ask 3 questions. What happened? What did you do? What did you observe? How did you feel? Of what does this remind you? Of your real life out there, what is coming to mind? And thirdly, how do we apply these learnings to new situations and new experiences? Well, I'll give you an example from my recent trip to Uganda, working with South Sudanese refugees and Ugandans. The big wind blows. If you watch it without sound, looks like some kind of silly game. One of those one fewer chairs than kid types. There's a pile of cards in the middle of the circle, and I pick up the one on top and I read it. It's easy, meant to be comfort zone stuff. The big wind blows for all those who are wearing blue today. This is a test run to make sure that everyone has understood the instructions. They look around the circle, down at what they put on this morning, and then the wearers of blue jump up from their chairs and rush around the circle looking for another chair. You can't return to your own chair, it has to be a different one. And the person standing in the middle is also going to be looking for a chair, leaving one person chairless. This exercise usually happens right at the beginning of a training, the first day. And its goals are many: to energize us, to lower all kinds of barriers through the magic of laughter and movement. It also gives us critical information about and impressions of who's in the room. Written on the cards are assertions. And if the assertion applies to you, then you get up and run. Some are funny, some are confusing, some give pause. The big wind blows for all those who have ever been the object of oppression. Immediately followed by, and the order is important, the big wind blows for all those who have ever been the subject of oppression. Object. Of this room of mostly South Sudanese refugees and Ugandans. So I'm going to go back to, written on the cards are assertions. If the assertion applies to you, then you get up and run around the room. Some of them are funny, some are confusing, some are meant to give pause. The big wind blows for all those who have ever been the object of oppression. and immediately followed by, and the order is important. The big wind blows for all those who have ever been the subject of oppression. Object. Well, this group of mostly South Sudanese and Ugandans, most of them get up, many don't, including 2 women. Subject of oppression, the oppressor. Even fewer get up and move. Some cards are trying to get at things like their awareness of or interest in the news, or having been invited to a training on peace and being religious people, their capacity to recite a verse on peace from their respective holy text. Religion is taken seriously, not as some flawed system of meaning to be dismissed, dispensed with, but rather as a well-interrogated tool in the peacemaker's toolbox, thereby effectively dismantling religion as a root cause of violence. By this time, the room is in a state of pandemonium. Plastic chairs fall easily under the force of flying bodies and tip right over when 2 bodies end up in the same chair at the same time. My minimally sandaled left foot has been used a couple of times already by others to launch themselves across the room. Half of the participants are young men between the ages of 18 and 24. Of the 26 in the room, only 6 of them are women, 3 Muslim, 3 Christian. Some of the men are in their 40s, mostly Ugandans, representatives of a host country to more than 400,000 refugees. 40,000 of them living in the Adjumani and Rhino refugee camps here in West Nile State, famous for having given its name to a disease and notorious as a key battleground for the Lord's Resistance Army. Then the big wind blows for all those who have ever participated in a demonstration, for all those who have ever been arrested, for all those who have ever pointed a gun to kill. Nobody gets up. Somehow it's the human knot. A few days later, another one of those silly games meant to get at problem solving, collaboration, communication, leadership, perseverance, perspective, that triggers near Kungami Ruai. He suddenly jumps out of his chair and begins to pace agitatedly within the circle. Up until now, he's been quiet, but now he erupts. Emotional dams bursting their confines within. He had been forcibly recruited by the Sudan People's Liberation Army as a young boy. They rounded up a group of us and marched us to this house and locked us in with sheep and chicken and goats. One of the other boys found some gasoline and threw a lit match into it. It was terrible. It was so terrible, the screaming. But we were able to get out. We escaped. And so we ran as hard as we could. We ran through the bush just as a helicopter gunship was approaching us, firing down on us. One of the shells hit my friend, taking his head off. To the boys' horror, the now headless body of their friend continued to run. Nier turned to his friend on the other side and screamed, "Is my head still on?" After several steps, the headless body crumpled to the ground. Eventually, they were all captured. Little boys, in a sense, children. And for the next several years, they killed, looted, and maimed for the SPLA. The room has fallen silent. Someone sobs. I'm conscious of images in my mind of my 12-year-old grandson merging with those of 10-year-old Pierre. And who knows how many others in this room. What is it? Why? How is it that a soul of a country has become so hard that it has come to the point of violating its primordial mandate to care for its children? On my arrival in Guwahati, Assam, Northeast India, I was confronted with something a little novel for me. An all-male group, 40 men, all of them representatives of 5 communities who had been involved in protracted and violent confrontation. The goal of this training was to design processes that would issue in locally based peace commissions that could intervene in conflict before it turned into violence. And so we were concentrating on 2 topics in particular, gender and identity. How can I acknowledge the identity of the other without loss to my own? How can I forget? How can I possibly forgive? But what if we were to regard our tribal and religious identities as a rich tapestry of diverse threads, rather than rivals whom we have been taught from birth to dehumanize, hate, and kill? What would the Northeast look like if we were to work together to transform the negative energies of internecine violence into the positive energies of resistance to and non-cooperation with the central government's policies of divide and conquer? Typically, one of the ways by which we address issues of gender is with a fishbowl, a gender fishbowl. 2 concentric circles, women in the middle having a conversation, men on the outside listening in. We ask 2 questions. The first one, what's the ideal woman in your culture? Well, there's invariably a sigh that goes around this knees to knees tight circle, and the men lean in. And I've found that it doesn't really matter if you pose that question in Toronto or Timbuktu, San Francisco or Santo Domingo, Manila or Manhattan. All the answers are variations on the same theme, the same common narrative, the rule of men, with local distinctives. Girls are not for educating, they would say if we were in South Sudan. Our role is to bring cows into the marriage and have babies, lots of babies, fetch the water, grind the millet, tend the cows, till the gardens. You don't need an education for that. We just have to stay home and be quiet. When our husband beats us, we're supposed to be grateful. When the next wife arrives, we're supposed to be polite. Our work begins even before we are old enough and big enough to strap our baby brother or sister on our backs, carry water on our heads, and hoe the sorghum. Bought and sold with cows, lots of cows, into polygamous relationships. Their genitals mutilated at puberty to keep them from wandering. Women are little more than slaves. Their literacy rate second only to Afghanistan. The second question is this. Is this okay with you? The sigh sounds more like a groan this time. The men are starting to get restless, hardly knowing what to do with what they're hearing, and they're beginning to figure out that they are eavesdropping on a conversation that otherwise would not happen within their hearing. The litany begins. Well, we have no say. Decisions about our villages, about our lives are made, and we have no say. While the men are out in the village square, drinking tea, talking, and the boys are out playing football amongst the eucalyptus trees, the girls are sweeping, washing clothes, stoking fires, stirring pots. By the end of one of these trainings, both women and men, through conversations with one another, are beginning to understand this concept. Any society that marginalizes 50% of its population is doomed to permanent underdevelopment and a permanent warrior culture. On my arrival in Northeast India, if we go back there, remember they're all men. There are no women. So what do we do about gender? The men have been struggling. Usually we do this exercise close to the beginning, but this time it's left towards the second last day. Men have been struggling with cultural norms that would exclude women while they work on designing processes for their peace commissions. So we're going to concentrate on two issues. Back here in India, we decide how we're going to do this by dividing the group so that half the men are designated as women. They put shawls over their heads, some of them costuming themselves. And the same questions are asked. But the answers are remarkably echoing, and accurately so, those of women. They get it. Hilarious and profound, but they get it. Half of the women in their peace commissions, half of the membership in their peace commissions will be women. An hour later, we're out on the basketball court, engaged now in this playful but powerful exercise known as the ankle walk. It never fails to issue in surprising insights on the part of the participants. I'm stunned, recalling the depth of their hostility of such a short time ago. And here these men are throwing their arms over the shoulders of former enemies, now engaged in the common task of racing the other team across the basketball court. 20 sets of ankles joined together. Silly games? Or the heart and soul rending and mending at the service of peace? Aren't we tired of war? Do we really believe that dropping bombs on people are going to convince them of our superior goodness and our peaceful intentions? Can we trust peace negotiation processes played out before an all-male display of military prowess? Are we not all weary of coffers drained to provide security, so-called, when the security for which we yearn is that of food, clean water, shelter, a sustainable environment, worthy work, and thriving communities of resilience? Nonviolence works. In Sudan, Fewer than 250 trained trainers since 2005 have trained more than 100,000 people in 89 tribes across the Sudans. Many of them participating in a largely youth-driven movement called Garifna, which means we're fed up. And the subject of a documentary by Al Jazeera, English, entitled How to Mobilize a Million. In June of 2012, that mobilization resulted in massive street protests across the country. Many of them were arrested and tortured. Many now live in exile. But it's not a failure. It's the solid next step towards the tipping point that will see dictator President Omar al-Bashir overthrown through nonviolent peaceful resistance. In Northeast India, one particular observer participant is a professor in a theological college. He returned to his classrooms to train and teach his students what he had learned and to discern together with them how to put this into action. Well, in April, a year ago, the meticulously planned and organized bike tour for peace took place. They had begged and borrowed, rebuilt and restored enough bikes to make it happen. They visited the 10 most conflictive communities in 4 states, logging 3,000 kilometers and meeting with civil society organizations, women's movements, student unions, with business, temple, church, and mosque leaders, as well as with politicians and members of the military and the insurgency. Nobody put in a word for war. Nobody. These 16 young men and their teacher have come to understand the power of disruption and non-cooperation, the superior force, disarming of nonviolent civil resistance. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I stood here this morning and I spoke on the verse that says, "And Jesus wept," and I talked about the power of tears in our life. And whether they be tears of sadness or tears of joy, I don't think there is many dry eyes here tonight. Because you've touched hearts, I believe, with both the message of some pain in our world, but also the possibility. And that produces some tears. Tears of pain and hurt, but also joy. So thank you. We have time for 1, maybe 2 questions. Does anybody have a question they'd like to ask of LeeAnn tonight? Just from where you are. And you'll have to say it out really loud if you've got a question.
It was no 5-year plan. I fell into it. I was at home for 16 years raising babies, and I started to volunteer doing human rights monitoring and accompaniment in Central America during the late 1980s while I was in seminary. And then it morphed into different kinds of accompaniment and then eventually training that included things like the things I named: economic literacy, conflict transformation, gender stuff, gender and violence, religion and violence. And I work with different organizations depending on the country and what is the need. It just happened. I didn't plan for it.
Anyone else?
I've just returned. The ones I'm talking about are pretty current. There was another project in Uganda that I was doing that was a little off my usual track, but it was doing sort of girls empowerment with eventually 4,000 girls, and but it also involved supplying them with sanitary napkins that last for a year, giving them 4 of these, a pair of underpants, and so that they don't leave school. As soon as girls start to menstruate, they don't have the money to buy the stuff at the store, and so they quit school, and they then are married early, have babies early, and have many babies, and their voice is effectively removed from the public square. And so what we talk about is gender sort of stuff and how their country needs the feminine voice. But otherwise, working with these refugees, so one thing I did not include is actually some of the most recent headlines from South Sudan. They're just really appalling, And I haven't actually been able to get back to South Sudan since 2012. It's one of those places my government doesn't want me to go to. Mind you, I don't usually pay attention. So working with so many South Sudanese refugees in Uganda looks as if it'll be something I'll be doing for a while. The peace tour on bikes is peace tour number 2 is happening in January, and this time they will include women. And at this point, I think they've got 30 bikers signed up at this point. I don't have the words to explain how unbelievably, incredibly incredible it is that people are talking the way they are in Northeast India, that people are inviting them back to their villages to deal with ongoing issues of conflict and violence. And so they're going to do it again. Never mind these 16 young men who are just absolutely transformed. I did an interview with them in December of 2014, and they're just, actually I saw some of them again when I was in India in May. So they are just doing amazing things. So those are the current ones. I'll be back in India, I hope in January, and back to Uganda, and in Colombia, and various other places. But those are some of the main focuses. Also the Philippines, South Mindanao, or South Philippines, Mindanao. Thank you.
LeeAnn, thank you so very, very much. Most appreciated.